Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. The 111-minute conversation between Nichol Kessinger and Chris Watts on the night of August 12th was a very troubling piece of evidence. It was troubling because of the length of the conversation. It was troubling because of the context of the conversation. It was troubling because the fact of the conversation wasn't disclosed, not by Chris Watts, not by Nichol Kessinger, and not even by the investigators or the district attorney in an explicit way. And what I mean is Chris Watts never mentioned it. Nichol Kessinger sort of admitted to it sort of eventually, but even the discovery is quite vague on it. It's not even mentioned in the warrantless arrest affidavit. And so even from a very broad true crime perspective, I've covered quite a few cases. It's rare that you get the when I say involvement, I just mean the relevance of a particular person kind of right in the middle of a crime. And what I mean is the contention of True Crime Rocket Science is that the children were murdered first, probably around about 7 o'clock on Sunday evening, which gave Watts time to make this call and not worry about making the call for almost 2 hours. And then there was the murder afterwards, which literally happened again according to True Crime Rocket Science about 2 hours after the call, maybe a little bit more than that, as soon as Shanann arrived home. So the call ended sort of 10 past 11, so 2.5 to 3 hours later Shanann was killed. And then Watts got to work processing the bodies, packaging them, removing clothes, washing. He had to washing up the crime scene and so on. But regardless of all that, the fact is, and also regardless of when you think the crime happened, where or whatever, this huge call for 111 minutes slap bang in the middle of Sunday night is it's like a huge red flag fluttering in the breeze, and a lot of people didn't know what to make of it. I would argue that a lot of people still don't know what to make of it. But one of the first questions that were asked of Chris Watts was, why didn't he just get a divorce, right? And the answer, and there is an answer to that question. If you're going to ask that question, answer it. Don't simply leave it open-ended. The answer to the question is, divorce is hard. It's expensive. It takes time. It's difficult, right? An affair is easy. Cheating is easy and it's cheap. And as we see in this situation, having this 111 conversation, the last sort of moment before Shanann was arriving home, it was easy to do, easy to get away with. Divorce is taking responsibility and doing things the right way, but it's costly. You've got to hire a lawyer, you give up certain things and so on. And this is true for both parties, not just the husband, it's also the wife. And so it actually makes sense to also ask the question, why didn't she get divorced? Why didn't Shanann get divorced? And we'll get to that in a second. But if you ask the question about the divorce, interestingly, there was an article just sort of mentioning kind of what we think we know, which is that Chris Watts spoke to Shanann prior to murdering her, in other words, Shanann knew that Watts wanted to get a divorce just before she died, right? In other words, Shanann knew just before she died, she knew theoretically what the reason was, that there was an issue probably in Chris Watts's mind regarding how it was going to happen, what it was going to look like, how it was going to play out, whether he was prepared to go down that route with her, whether they were going to work together at it, or whether they were going to, it was going to be like really, really acrimonious. I don't believe that argument happened, and the reason I don't believe it happened is the murder was the divorce. The murder was why. That's the answer to the question. Why didn't he just get a divorce? Because he thought murder would be easy. I think that says a lot. When I say easier, I mean including the financial arrangements that come about through divorce. He was thinking just as cheating on his wife was easier, well, cheating on getting a divorce would also be easier, financially speaking. And so I think there's tremendous symbolism in this idea of Chris Watts pretending that he asked his wife for a divorce, and then that's when the murder happened. I think there's a lot of symbolism in that, in juxtaposing the two. Again, I don't believe it really happened, but I think by saying it in that way, he's acknowledging his discomfort with the whole notion of talking to her about divorce, right? So just to be explicit, it wasn't talking to her about divorce that led to the murder. It was not talking to her about divorce, not wanting to confront that with her, that led to the murder. Of course, if you look at what the YouTubers are fixated on at the moment, it's not so much Chris Watts, it's not so much Shanann, it's all the Mistress. It's all the Mistress's fault. And now it's gone beyond that. Now the Mistress is some kind of witch apparition. She's sort of got some sort of dark involvement in pagan things and crystals, and you know, it's like she's achieved this incredible power, and she's got this team of wizards running around with her, conjuring dark things, and everyone's getting really very excited about that, and all of this seems to have come from two words. The word dark things appear 3 times in Cadell's book Letters to Christopher. They're very vague. What are dark things? And between some of these references to dark things is also a reference to a dark spirit. Was Christopher tempted by a dark spirit? And so he seems to be suggesting that, but at the same time there's this notion of Nichol being involved in dark things, I guess is the way to put it. And so you put the two together, and then you say, was Chris Watts led astray by a dark spirit? Well, where did the dark spirit come from? Or didn't it come from Nichol? On this channel we don't deal with that kind of stuff, the paranormal and the hocus pocus stuff. We're going to be dealing here with facts, and that's so. If we're going to ask a question like, why didn't he just get a divorce? I don't think the answer is dark things. I don't think the answer is a dark spirit. I don't think the answer is hoodoo or something like that. The answer is, why doesn't anyone want to get a divorce? And so we're going to interrogate this question about divorce and the law in terms of Nichol Kessinger. But before we get there, we should bear in mind that even 1 month before her 3rd pregnancy, Shanann herself was considering divorce. Now, why didn't she go through with it? If early-ish in 2018, around about let's say April, around about April, that's quite a few months before the murders, Shanann herself was thinking about divorce. She was speaking to a divorce lawyer. Why didn't she get divorced? we can ask the same question to her. And we know from Kessinger that when he got back from North Carolina, that's when he officially told her, according to her, that that he intended to get a divorce and they were putting the house up for sale. I don't think that's true. I don't think Chris Watts and Shanann were officially getting divorced at any point, and I don't think they were even properly separated at any point. The trip to North Carolina was that to some extent, a kind of a separation, but it was kind of a unofficial separation. It was a separation by virtue of the fact that she was somewhere else. Certainly when he went to meet her in North Carolina, that separation became evident, certainly in Shanann's mind. And then it became even more evident, when she arrived home and they were sleeping apart. Then it was becoming very evident. So the separation aspect really only kind of became manifest when Shanann arrived back home just before she left for Arizona. And so in Chris Watts's mind, it was happening, the divorce was happening. And that's when he mentioned it to Kessinger. He mentioned it in the Lazy Dog restaurant on the Saturday night. And so in his mind, he needed to get divorced from Shanann because he said he was. But although he'd said it, he wasn't doing it. And and this is the part that's not acknowledged. He knew how it would be with Shanann. If Nutgate was how it was, imagine what a divorce and an affair and her being pregnant, imagine how she'd respond to that. Imagine how she would burn the house down and leave a sort of a scorched earth policy. And Chris Watts is a coward. He wouldn't have been able to confront that kind of thing. He wouldn't know how to deal with it. He didn't know what it would look like. And so that's why he didn't want to get a divorce. But the real question here is Nichol Kessinger does seem to be guilty of something. She may not have been completely forthcoming during the interrogation, but that's not what we're getting at. It's that 111-minute conversation on the night of the murders that just feels very... it's a huge red flag. Even if Kessinger is completely innocent in terms of not being involved, that conversation is kind of slap bang in the middle of the timeline of the crime. And so I think it is important to acknowledge that there's an appetite for revenge and there's an appetite for accountability in terms of Nichol. And let's try and answer that question on its own merits. Let's try and answer the question, how could she be accountable in terms of the law? Just in terms of her involvement with Chris Watts, in terms of having an affair with him, and what does divorce law say about that? And at the end of this episode, I'll be revealing a little bit more about a second book I'm writing in the Silver Fox series. It's about the wedding, the wedded side of things in terms of the Chris Watts case. And I'll be talking a little bit about that. Before we get there, just another thank you to the 6,000 subscribers that are now part of this channel. Welcome to all of you. I haven't really introduced myself to many of you. If you like, you can go and look at my author page, look at the bio on my author page on Amazon.com. If you're not sure where to get it, just Google Two-Face Annihilation or Two-Face Oblivion and click on my name, and then you will go to my bio and you can see that I've written 94 books. And I'm fairly new to YouTube. I've only been on YouTube for 2 months, but I've been writing books for a couple of years, and I've covered a lot of cases. John Benet Ramsey, Jodi Arias, Scott Peterson, Casey Anthony, West Memphis 3, O.J. Simpson, Madeleine McCann, and now Chris Watts. I've also written a book on mass shooters, and quite recently this year a book on incels. And then I've also written a couple of books on the 96 Everest tragedy, and I've also written a book, The Murder of Vincent van Gogh, and there are quite a lot of other books besides those, but those sort of stand out. In any event, if you're interested in true crime, you're interested in cogent analysis, intelligent discussion, sensible true crime analysis, then I think you'll be happy at this channel. Please subscribe, share, like, ring the bell, and leave a comment, and let's get started. So in this episode, I want to focus on the Law and Nichol Kessinger. I don't really want to talk too much about Shanann. I don't want to talk too much about Chris Watts. I really want to sort of address this whole idea of, practically speaking, how could Nichol Kessinger be found guilty of something in terms of this case, right? Obviously, True Crime Rocket Science sees absolutely no merit in the sort of conspiracy theories that Kessinger is involved in any way, directly or indirectly, in terms of the crime. You can say she's involved in terms of she knew Chris Watts and she was having an affair, but nothing beyond that. So that is the sort of focus of this episode. You know, if you disagree, then you can leave now and be happy. But if you're interested in the topic, it is quite interesting. Just looking at, could Nichol Kessinger have been prosecuted for having an affair with Chris Watts? And it's quite interesting what the law says about that, because again, I think people want to acknowledge the idea that Kessinger did do something wrong, that what happened was Chris Watts' fault, certainly, but it was also someone else's influence on him that isn't above reproach, right? Now, I mentioned earlier that Shanann went to see a divorce lawyer. She didn't sort of go into his office, but she was in a restaurant and she approached this guy. His name was Hamza. He's on LinkedIn. I have written about him, but she sort of approached him and around about 10 o'clock at night and wanted to know whether the courts in Colorado would give custody of her children in a divorce to the man in the case. And Hamza confirmed that it was possible, and Shanann then also asked, is divorce a messy process? And he told Shanann, well, only if there's infidelity in the marriage, then it can be messy. And then he recommended her doing everything possible to save her marriage rather than filing for divorce. At the time, Hamza said he remembered that Shanann talked about also wanting to have another child, but he was concerned for her health, in terms of lupus and all that kind of thing. And even then, Shanann may have mentioned that Chris wanted a baby boy. So what's interesting here are the sort of issues of infidelity that are discussed and how that this can make divorce messy. And we know Chris Watts was messing around. We don't know if Shanann knew it then. We don't know if she suspected it then. But we know that she was thinking about divorce then, and that is something. And we also know that she then went ahead and got pregnant. But we're not here to discuss that aspect of it. I am going to be doing a video on Shanann subsequent to this one, but what we want to address here is the idea of the cheating spouse, and then also the adulterer, the mistress. What are their sort of legal responsibilities in this case? And that's really where we want to cut off the boundary of this discussion. Just in terms of that, what does the law say? Now, I did study family law. I do know a little bit about divorce law. But I've also got to admit that it's not my area. I'm not a specialist in it. I haven't been divorced. And my expertise is true crime, not divorce law. It's a separate area, and I don't proclaim to be an expert on it, but what I can say is there are certain rights and obligations, and there are certain nuances in terms of the law, not only between different states in America, but also internationally. There's sort of different ways that different groups of people deal with it. In some countries, if you commit adultery, you get the death penalty. In others, nothing happens. So, which is the appropriate penalty? And I put up a blog some time ago. Is it just desserts, or should Kessinger sort of be treated almost like the? Should we treat Kessinger like Hester Prynne in Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel The Scarlet Letter? Should we brand her with a sort of an A and sort of continue to sort of put her on the scaffolding? And that is exactly what is happening, by the way. That is happening constantly on YouTube. You've got one person who just can't stop referring to the gal from Anadarko. It's just all about her, right? And that is exactly it. It's turning Kessinger into a kind of Hester Prynne. And it just shows you how, in some ways, backward our society is, and in some ways, we're very progressive and we're very modern, and we've graduated to social media. But there's another way where we've backslidden into very archaic attitudes to our fellow man. Dating back into quite far back in history, very, very conservative attitudes. And no one's to say what's right or wrong. It's just to say that it's not quite in step with the law as it is now, and it's also not quite in step with society as a mainstream. So, whether these people have huge flocks supporting them, that's another story. You can say, well, yes, a lot of people in society prefer this more conservative etiquette. The question is, what does the law say about it? And that's what we're addressing here. And when you think about it in a practical way, when you discuss it in a factual way, you see kind of how absurd it is in practice. And what I mean is, okay, so your spouse has cheated on you, as happened in the Chris Watts case, and you are very angry about it, and it's not right, and you want your revenge. And now, what could you justifiably do to get your revenge? And then you see that you can sue another party, and you can get $755,000 as a jackpot for the fact that your spouse cheated on you. You could, in another case, someone got $8.8 million. So you could clearly see a scenario where you could even pay your wife or promise your wife some kind of benefit if she cheats on you, because you're both going to be fantastically enriched. I mean, imagine getting $10 million for the for the bargain of your partner cheating on you. I'm sorry if that sounds facetious, but as we're going to see later on, you can actually see a scenario where that can actually happen, where the law is actually allowing this kind of mischief to take place. And so in terms of this particular case where someone sued a adulterous counterpart, so bear in mind it's not the wife that's being sued, it's the adulterous counterpart, it's the other party that's being sued, right? In this case, the guy's wife cheated on him and he sued the other man, right? Now, if we go to the Washington Post, the guy who lodged the lawsuit said, I filed the case because I feel it's very important that people understand the sanctity of marriage. And that kind of makes sense. I think most people who are married understand that. I think, I think people who are married want marriage to be treated with respect and want it to be right. But that's one side of the story. If you go to the Watts family and you say, well, was there sanctity in their marriage? And then you look at the fact that, well, they lived apart for 6 weeks or 5 weeks. You look at how happy were both of them in terms of their marriage. You look at, well, didn't Shanann want to get divorced anyway? Didn't she want to, or wasn't she contemplating leaving her husband for whatever reason? And wasn't he contemplating leaving her for whatever reason? And then they thought they could sort of patch it together by having a child, which didn't work. It undermines this idea of the sanctity of marriage. A marriage can be destroyed from within just by the people within the marriage. In terms of you don't need a third party to blame for the fact that a marriage dissolves. It can be the people inside the marriage no longer being in love with one another. So although this idea of sanctity is true, I think it's a bit more complicated than that. And so if we go into the backstory of the Lord, it turns out the same as well. There was a scenario in history where the husband would sue his wife's parents for convincing her to leave him. So you'd have a scenario where a cowboy in sort of 18th century America would his wife would abandon him, and then he would then sue her parents because they'd convinced her to leave him, right? And in this sense, it's a scenario where the husband sees his wife as a possession, and but can you see how it actually doesn't make any sense today? You just can't imagine that happening today. Because why? Because women today are entitled to legal rights as well. And England is just one country that's abolished the alienation of affection and criminal conversation altogether. But not everywhere. Not everywhere in America has done the same. Certain states have revised their torts to make the action gender neutral. And so what that's already suggesting is that there are some states where it's not. So in other words, where a spouse cheats, you can sue the other party who's a male, right? Without changing the law, you can only sue the male for stealing your wife away. If you think of it in another way, you have another husband who loses his wife, or in a situation where the wife cheats, can the other husband's wife sue the other woman, right? Can a woman sue another woman, or can it only be a man suing the adulterous man? I'm not sure if you're following me with this, but there are many states where it's only a situation where men can sue men, where the other man's the adulterous party. Women can't sue women, where the other woman is the adulterous party. In other words, if Shanann were alive, she couldn't sue Kessinger if Kessinger lived in a particular state, according to these tort laws anyway. There is another aspect dealing with adultery as a misdemeanor, where you can be fined or you can have a jail term. We're not going to get into that right now, but we will get to it. It's just interesting how this is quite a sexist law to begin with. In any event, in this cowboy scenario way back when, the focus shifted from protecting the property rights at the time. So in other words, the cowboy's wife was seen as his property, and eventually the law expanded to protecting the institution of marriage, which, as you can imagine, makes more sense. I mean, that's how divorce law separated from, property law, personal property law. Does that make sense? And so we go over to an article in Vice referring to the states where you can sue the person your spouse cheated with. And these states are Hawaii, Mississippi, New Mexico, South Dakota, Utah, and North Carolina. 8 states all in all. I've mentioned 6 states there. I'm not quite sure what the other 2 are, but the point is it's in a minority of states, the sort of historic artifact of the law. Now, even in the sort of articles that sort of deal with this, it's not all that explicit that these laws are being struggled against. In other words, even though the laws are in place and people are making use of them, it's something that is not necessarily wanted. So, for example, in North Carolina, there's been a 25-year struggle to repeal the Alienation of Affection and Criminal Conversation Act. Now, just think about those words in the context of the Chris Watts case and that 111-minute call. I mean, it's not strictly speaking true, but imagine if everyone was alive at that point. I don't think that's true either, but imagine if everyone was alive at that point and Chris Watts phones Nichol Kessinger, or she calls him, and during this long conversation with his mistress, he feels a sense of alienation of affection to his family. In other words, as he's being attracted to this is a fictional scenario, I'm just sketching something. In this discussion, he kind of just feels, wow, I don't really love my wife anymore, and I love you, and I don't even love my children, right? And then that escalates the conversation he's having with Kessinger to a criminal conversation. So in other words, she's sitting on her phone talking, and this then becomes a criminal conversation, and she then becomes liable. I'm just saying, within this idea, within the semantics of the law, do you think that's fair? And I can hear a lot of people saying it's absolutely fair, blah blah blah. But if you bring it down to your level, imagine if you talking to someone. Imagine if you are talking, either you are talking to an unmarried person and you married, or you being talked to, right, by a married person. And now that conversation could be treated as criminal. But now bear in mind, do you know that the person's married? Maybe you do. So is this now, are you committing a criminal offense? And you could say you are, but bear in mind, whether you think it's a criminal offense or not, it is happening all over America. The divorce stats are pretty shocking. The numbers of affairs people are having on an ongoing basis is pretty shocking. And so it's an ever-present thing. Do you really want to criminalize all those people? And so certainly in North Carolina an argument could be made, but what if this third party is the controlling cause of the breakdown of a marriage? Shouldn't you be able to go after them and just get whatever you want from them? And that is sort of part of the process in states like North Carolina, where you can sort of try and make an argument where the third party is entirely to blame. They led the trusting spouse astray, and it's all their fault. They're in control. They made it happen. Personally, I don't agree with that. I don't think you can lay the blame on an affair on one person. I think it's I think it has something to do with 3 people, and especially 2 people. But I think 3 people are involved in an affair. So to make it all about one person and they're the controlling cause, I just don't think that's fair or rational. What do you guys think? And it's just ironic that what's happened with this law in North Carolina was that the law was sort of almost, one can say that it was tort law designed to protect farmers' possession, a cowboy's possessions, maybe at farm animals. And now women are being treated as farm women were treated like farm animals in these torts, where morality was being policed and personal relationships were being regulated. And you might say, well, if you're a well-behaving wife or husband, then that's fine. You don't mind your relationship policed, really, until you want to cheat, and until your partner's cheating on you, and then what must you do? Stay in the marriage and honor the marriage even though they're cheating? Because bear in mind, there's a scenario in a marriage where you may try and do it the right way, and you no longer want to be in a relationship with your partner, and you now institute divorce proceedings, but they don't happen immediately. So for the course of the divorce proceedings, which may say last, I know someone whose divorce took several years, and during that time the question is, was there infidelity? And so if there isn't infidelity, then there's no leverage for the other party to get some kind of extra benefit. But if there is infidelity, then the benefit is lost. And so you kind of have this scenario where within the marriage you're still married, but you want to get divorced. Now you can't get divorced because it's still kind of being argued, but now you've lost your enjoyment of marital relations, but you can't enjoy them elsewhere either. Can you see how it's becoming quite muddy now? It's quite a muddy scenario. And so as early as 2012, which is when the Watts got married, I think, in 2012, a paper came out in the Elon Law Review showing that there's a serious potential for abuse, fraud and intimidation, where the torts could be used to gain money from a plaintiff's ex, even when they didn't want their paramour held responsible for the affair. And this is something that's covered in Vox.com. And so we saw there's also been sort of adaptations to this law, just putting some restrictions in place, saying, well, you can only file actions based on what's occurred before the couple formally separated, right? So in other words, if you've stated that there's a formal separation, then you can't be held liable. Now think about that in terms of the Watts case. According to Kessinger, and I don't know whether she's been informed of this through lawyers or whether it was actually true, but regardless, Kessinger's statement was that when Watts returned from North Carolina, he told her that they were officially getting divorced, right? And so in terms of that, again, regardless of whether you believe it or not, in terms of that, if you apply the law in this particular aspect, and I'm not saying it's even applicable, but if you do apply it, then the damages, the destruction that happened to the Watts family happened after Kessinger was told about the divorce being official. And so she can't be held liable from that because that's within that period when everyone was aware of it, right? So in other words, it is mischievous to be conducting an affair when there's the appearance of a marriage that is healthy, and when people are going to marriage counseling, as happened in that Washington Post article, the expenses related to counseling and all that kind of thing. And so there is deception then from potentially a mistress or the adulterer. And so what this law is really trying to encourage is transparency, is to say, okay, you can get separated. Whatever happens after the separation, that can't be part of the actions. So in other words, you can be faithful to your spouse. Once you've separated, then you can have sexual relations with someone else. Does that make sense? And so, when you look at where the law is applied, this tort law, according to Vice, they referred to it being destructive in the states that still have them, in terms of where families can't have a healthy interaction anymore, they can't even heal. and one woman referred to the application of this law, preventing her from opening a credit card account, preventing her from buying a home, preventing her from buying a car. She sort of referred to herself as becoming a teenager all over again. I don't think in the sexual sense, but in the sort of having your rights as someone to, transact independently taken completely away. And this whole procedure is described as destroying someone, going to the extreme of destroying someone and calling it a sick game. And I think this law, this sort of old law, this antiquated law, speaks of a different mindset in the past in America, and the way that people are going after Nichol Kessinger, in also a sick game on YouTube. We know the people who keep talking about her. Every single video they make is about her. It's the same nonsense about her. It's an attempt to destroy someone, and they don't use her name. If you want to check whether they are making destructive statements and untrue statements, then look at whether they're actually using her name. And they're not using her name, because if they were, they would be sued and their channels would be taken down. But they are going to an extreme to destroy someone as if she's not a real person, as if she doesn't have a real life. And it is a sick game. And this is the mirror. This is a intertextuality between the merits of this case and then the court of social media opinion, which is not that's a kangaroo court, if anything. Having said all that, it's not, again, I don't want to swing the pendulum to say what Kessinger did is good, or what Kessinger did is innocent. She had an affair with a married man. It ended horribly, catastrophically, and so beyond her, lack of coming completely clean right in the beginning to the interrogators, it's a fact that adultery is a misdemeanor in most states. So where there's this sort of antiquated tort law in a minority of states, it's recognized as a misdemeanor in most states in America, and there are laws against it. In Michigan and Wisconsin, it's categorized as a felony. And this is where I think it's really interesting, just how widely the punishments vary. In Maryland, there's a $10 fine for adultery. In Massachusetts, you can go to jail for 3 years. So you can just see how society has different feelings about adultery, and none of them are wrong. Whatever you feel about it is true for you. But you can't apply something like that in a society that you're not part of, if that makes sense. Or you've got to be careful doing that. So for example, if you go to Saudi Arabia, you can't say, well, I'm from somewhere else and I really want to commit adultery and get away with it because I can where I'm from. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. In Saudi Arabia or some of those countries, if you commit adultery, you can be beheaded. More than likely, the woman in this scenario, not the man, which again seems very unfair. The woman gets stoned or beheaded or whatever. Sometimes I think both adulterous participants can. I'm not totally familiar with the law in those countries, but the point is, if you in a different society, you've got to be respectful of what's going on there. I don't mean respectful to say agree with it. I'm saying the law is the law, and if you run foul of it, you can be in serious trouble. And so if you're in different states, you need to be aware of what the law is. And so that's simply what I'm trying to get you guys to acknowledge in terms of Nichol Kessinger, is where she lives, in the community she lives, is a particular law, and whether you want to brand her with an A is to some extent irrelevant in terms of that particular law. Having said that, there are 16 states where you can actually go to jail in America for adultery. And these 16 states are Arizona, Florida, Kansas, Illinois, Massachusetts, Oklahoma, Idaho, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Utah, New York, Mississippi, Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. Which state's missing from that list? Yes, Colorado, obviously. What's quite funny in this particular article from the forum, it refers to, in Maryland, it says you can go to the cinema for a date, or you can change the spouse for the same money. In other words, the penalty for infidelity is just $10. The price of going to a movie. I do think it's significant that Shanann and Chris Watts were from North Carolina, and in North and South Carolina there are laws against adultery. In South Carolina, you can go to prison for treason for 6 months to a year. I think we must just be clear that this analysis is conflating the idea of treason with a treasonous, in inverted commas, spouse. And so the 16 states where you can find and put a traitor in jail, but it's defined as, the act of treason is defined as intimate contact between the married person and the person who's not his spouse. Again, you can just hear through the language of it that it's very sort of outdated language. This particular article is translated from Russian, so I wouldn't put too much stake in it, but I think the idea is nevertheless interesting. If you go to a more reputable source, which is Salon, it refers to the states that are rushing to get outdated laws off the books. Salon refers to the crimes of adultery and fornication, making consensual sex a crime if the parties aren't married to each other. It's described as being unconstitutional in the wake of a 2003 Supreme Court case, Lawrence versus Texas. I'm not going to deal with that here. What I am going to just touch on is Salon refers to that same list of states that are make sexual acts illegal if one of the parties isn't married. An open ed in the Los Angeles Times asked the sort of rhetorical question, why is adultery still a crime? In that article, it refers to adultery being illegal in 21 states, including New York Times, where Trump lives. Okay, I'm not going to go into that. Another aspect that I think is not even addressed here is, you have a marriage ending badly, and then you can say, well, it's the fault of the mistress or whatever. But what about when you have a affair ending badly? So you have, the marriage, just if you put that out the take that off the desk and you look at the affair, and then an affair ends badly. What do the laws say about this? And so in this article by the Los Angeles Times, there's a section about adultery rarely being prosecuted as a criminal offense, but then when it is, it's arbitrary. And it's also, when it is prosecuted, it erodes confidence in the idea of the law. because what happens is some people are unfairly singled out. They're like blindsided, almost like in a game of Survivor. So in other words, you can have two people even in an affair, and then if something goes wrong, one of them can blindside the other one and use the law to kind of gain their revenge, or to almost sort of wrong foot the other one, right? Almost like in a kind of revenge scenario. You can imagine if the cheating spouse then sort of gets back with their wife and decides, I'm not going to cheat anymore. Well, then the other party can then still take legal steps against that one and say, oh, you know what, you cheated on me, you broke the law, right? So in terms of this particular case, her lover pleaded guilty, and then he lost his job. And when he, in terms of this particular charge, the prosecutor said, well, we're not stalking people trying to check whether they're cheating, but in a way it is. It just becomes a very, the surveillance aspect just becomes a bit sinister. And is it fair? Is it right to infringe people's privacies in this way? And so just to wrap up, often when there's adultery, there are job terminations, there's sanctions, demotions. In the military, according to the Los Angeles Times, you can have people discharged or prosecuted for infidelity. There can be sort of discipline. People can be fired just based on marital infidelity, and this includes, they refer to FBI trainees, fire department employees, librarians, police officers. All of these people can be dismissed for adultery when they're trying to become good citizens. And we know that with Nichol Kessinger, she lost her job. We know that Chris Watts lost his job very early on, although at that stage I didn't know what he'd done, but no one cares about him losing his job. But Kessinger lost her job, I think 7 to 10 days after the incident, and it was sort of explained away in that her contract simply wasn't renewed, but we all know that she did actually lose her job, and we know why. And then just to reiterate, adultery figures in the allocating of property and custody in divorce cases, so it's got a very important sort of stigma, where if one is the adulterer, then resources are shifted to the other. And the question is, what is right in these scenarios, and who can answer that? Can society answer that, or do individuals decide that? Can prosecutors decide that? What is the right answer? I mean, can you imagine being awarded $9 million for the fact that your partner cheated on you? I mean, again, it's almost an incentive that you'd want them to then cheat on you, especially if you don't love them very much. Okay, and I think that sort of brings us back to the question, should Kessinger have been prosecuted for something? Could she have been prosecuted for something? In terms of this particular aspect of the law, in Colorado, the answer seems to be no. In terms of could she be prosecuted, in terms of should she be, based on the Los Angeles Times, a survey showed that most Americans don't think adultery should be a crime, and that the law needs to catch up. Most Americans being between 2/3 and 3/4 of those surveyed, which is quite a large majority. I agree with that. I agree that it shouldn't be a crime. I think the Chris Watts case certainly shows an extreme example of what can happen when there is adultery, but I don't think you can put the blame on Kessinger that she ought to have known that this was going to happen. I think that is a big leap, and I think it's a very unfair leap to make, and a lot of people are making it. They're making it both through inference and through the fact that they've now made that logic leap to just assuming that she was totally involved and that she knew what was going on. It's just totally unfair, and it's branding her in an unfair way. And these people making these accusations should really be called to account. They should be put on a list and they should be monitored, and then when they make inexplicit statements they should be held accountable. If we're going to be honest, and again this is referring to the research by the Los Angeles Times, there's no evidence that a decline in legal sanctions would result in an increase in adultery. So if you change the law that it's less strict, it doesn't mean that this would lead to more adultery happening. Between 19% and 23% of men, so around about 1 out of every 5 men, and close to the same amount but less, 14% to 19% of women. That's close to 1 out of 5 women report being unfaithful at some point in their marriage. And if you look at those figures, they're a lot lower than in 1950, when the first studies were made on this. And it does seem as if legal prohibitions, as the Times says, persist because of legacy issues, because of symbolic reasons. I mean, the language is symbolic, the notions are symbolic, but they're archaic and they're no longer valid. And so this whole thing of conflating Kessinger with dark things is part of that outdated, antiquated, symbolic thinking, and I really do think it's time people moved on from that. As mentioned, I'm working on a book, the second book in the Silver Fox trilogy. It might be out before the end of the year, depending on how the book on Patrick Frazee goes, which should be out in November, towards the end of November. But that book deals with the marital aspects of the Chris Watts case in a lot of detail, and you'll really be fascinated by how the dynamics play out when you look at the Watts case from that perspective. When you look at it from the perspective of what was the marriage like as a married man, Watts compared to other people, what was how did he engage in his own marriage, how did he try to disengage. Then also from Shanann's perspective, what kind of wife was she, how was she married, how did she want to deal with divorce, how did she want to deal with what is going on, right? And then also Kessinger, what is her attitude to marriage and all that kind of thing. And then bringing all that back, what are our attitudes to marriage, and where does this case take us in terms of that thing, that dimension. In any event, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I will see you in another episode dealing with if there was a way Shanann could have avoided this outcome. I'm going to deal with a specific area, and then look out for trial day 10, just dealing with Friday's trial testimony in the Frazee case. I'll try to put that up sometime Sunday, maybe early Monday. In any event, thank you for listening, and please subscribe if you haven't already.